I'm Ruth Hummel, and I'm here in the Plainville Historic Center, and we're going to talk about the Tunxis Indians, the native people of our valley. The Tunxis homes were wigwams, and they were round domed buildings. The construction was made of young saplings that were bent over and pushed into the ground and staked out so it was very secure. They were covered with bark or mats that were made from the cattail reeds or any of the reeds that grow in the water and in the marshes around here. This is a picture of a wonderful sketch that we were just given of a finished wigwam, and you can see the furs hanging there and some of the pots and the cooking utensils and a big bear skin up on the top. They probably were rather snug, but to ensure that snugness, in the winter they would bank either soil or snow up around the bottoms of them. These houses, or wigwams, were built with two entrances, a north side and a south side hole, and whichever door was exposed to the elements was dictated by the weather. In other words, you might have the north door open in the summertime to keep it cool. There was also a smoke hole up in the top, and the fire pit would be directly under that smoke hole for ventilation. But even at that, colonists wrote that these wigwams were very, very smoky, and a lot of Indians had eye problems. A lot of the native people suffered from sore eyes and early loss of sight because of the intense smoke in the wigwams. Around the sides of the inside of the wigwam, there were benches or beds, and you could either sit on those in the daytime or you could lounge and sleep on them at night. These were covered with hides, and they were covered again with those rush mats made of the cattail leaves. Now the food of these people was quite extensive, quite a nice menu. They were gatherers, they were hunters, and they were gardeners. They gleaned all sorts of wondrous food from the nature that nature had provided them with. Ground nuts, which were very nutritional. They dug cattail roots, and we have some dried cattail roots here. There's a tuber on the end, and that was ground up into a flour-like substance. This is wild carrot on the end, and it really smells like a carrot. We know it today as Queen Anne's lace, a very pretty wildflower. They gathered nuts, they gathered berries of all kinds. There were many, many kinds of berries, a lot of kinds of nuts. And these were gathered a lot by the children, sent out into the woods, and they knew what to get, what was poisonous, what was edible. Now they hunted the deer, they hunted the bear, wild turkeys. We have some wild turkey feathers here. Great, huge birds, but not as succulent and fat as the turkeys we're going to have for Thanksgiving. These were hunted very early with spears and later with bows and arrows as history progressed. Ducks were a very favorite target and a very wanted food item. The white-tailed deer was to our woodland Indians similar it was a similar item as the buffalo was to the Plains Indians, in that it provided everything. It provided clothing in the hides, it provided food, all the parts of the animals was used. And even tools were made of the antlers of deer, and this is a tool used in refining stone tools. It's used to make a serrated edge, and this is very hard and a good fit for your hand. The corn that they raised in their gardens, along with the beans and the squash, giving them the three sisters, was a very different kind of corn than we have today, and it would have been pounded in a pestle, mortar and pestle, similar to this. And this is the size that the Indian corn would have been. And this, of course, is the size of the corn we have today. Now inside, this is funnel-shaped, so that the corn is way down in the center, and you can get a good pound on it. And they say that as the squaws pounded corn like this, the sound would echo and reverberate through the woods for miles and miles and miles. And many times the ladies got together and had, almost an afternoon gathering and pounded their corn. And let me tell you, there's not much action in here. There's not much happening with that hard corn. Of course, to cook the corn and cook all these vegetables, they had pumpkins and they had squash and they had the corn and the beans. And they had several kinds of vessels to cook them in. But let me tell you about the three sisters. The reason these three vegetables were called the three sisters is because they depended on one another and they helped one another, as sisters are supposed to. And the corn was planted first and grew tall and strong, and the beans grew up the corn supporting the bean vines, and then around the bottom would have been planted the squash, and the squash vines grew large, shady leaves, and they kept the moisture in the ground with the shade from the leaves on the squash. And therefore, they all helped one another. Pumpkin and squash was dried and hung in the teepees, or hung, in the wigwams. They also dried fish. They dried the venison from the deer. They smoked shellfish that they went down to Long Island Sound and got. They did a lot to preserve food for the winter. The berries were dried. The nuts, of course, were harvested. The Tunxis Indians from Farmington and from the Plainville area went down what was called Indian Trail. And that went along the bottom of what we call Bradley Mountain, or East Mountain today, all the way down under the hanging hills of Meriden, all the way down to Long Island, following the old Quinnipiac River. And that was called the Quinnipiac Trail. And the Indians went to the seashore for two things. They needed salt, and for years, historians didn't even realize that they did make salt and bring it back. But they would go and boil down the seawater and make salt and bring it back to their encampment, their village. They also went down and they collected large numbers of various kinds of shellfish and brought them back and smoked them, or smoked them there and brought them back. And that was a very nutritional and a very important food element for them in the winter times. Now people are still discovering at the shore, along our Connecticut shore, these huge midden piles of shellfish shells, just gigantic shell piles. And that's where the Indians went down and they would shell their fish and dry them, and it was almost like an excursion for them. After they pounded their corn, they had to store the corn. And it would be stored in a beautiful handmade basket like this. And this is an Algonquin basket, beautifully preserved. It has a little pattern on it that we may pick up on camera and we may not. But this was made with potatoes dipped in, cut into a pattern, and then the starch makes a reaction on the basket and you get a little pattern. Well, the corn and other foods were packed in these baskets, and then the baskets were submerged in sand piles. A sandbank would be typical. They would dig a hole, they would line it with the reed mats. Those reed mats they must have made a lot of them. They would line it with the reed mats, put in their baskets of thoroughly dried food, and cover it with 2 to 3 to 4 feet of good, clean, dried sand. This would preserve the food all half the winter, and it also protected the food elements from the weather, from animals, and even from other hungry Native Americans. It was a cache such as that was used to feed the Pilgrims when they first came here. They were starving, and the Indians dug into their winter supply and gave them corn. In appearance, the Algonquin speaking people, which included our Tunxis tribe, were tall and muscular and rather handsome people with very piercing eyes and long black hair, made all the blacker for dressing it with bear grease. We probably wouldn't like the way that bear grease smelled, but they probably wouldn't like the smell of some of our cosmetics. The ladies wore their hair either loose or in braids. The men also sometimes wore their hair loose. Boys, until they were the age of becoming a warrior, cut their hair about shoulder length. Now, if the women were wearing their hair in braids, they had fur covers for the braids. They also did beadwork. They used a number of things for ornamenting their clothing. One of the things that they used were deer toes. And the deer toes are nothing more than the hooves of the deer. And these are the two toes that you would see an impression of in the snow. And these are the dew claws, which are up higher on the deer's leg. And they like these on their clothes because they made a nice sound. And anything that jingled, they kind of like those on their clothes. And they wore porcupine quills. They used beads. They used feathers. Sometimes they used whole bird skins with the feathers on them. That was considered a very, very special ornament. Now the women dressed in long sleeveless dresses or long sleeveless shifts, and then below that in the cold weather, or if they were out in the brush, they would wear leggings and of course always the moccasins. The men wore a breech clout, which was kind of outdoor underwear, and also added the leggings as the winter progressed or the cold weather came. And in the really cold weather, they would add robes of the deer hides, and they would wear them with the fur inside. And this is true of the moccasins. In the wintertime, they wore them with the fur inside, and they might line them with moss, or they might line them with cattail fluff. Clothing was fairly simple and, of course, made of their good friend, the white-tailed deer. When the men went hunting and caught a deer, of course, it was a wonderful calorie-wise event for the family. But when the hunter killed the deer, he apologized to the deer and thanked the deer for his blessing and for his gift of his life, which meant food and clothing and weapons and tools for the Indian people. The Indians believed that all things in nature had a spirit: the rocks, the wind, the trees, and the animals. And they treated them all with great respect, and they wasted nothing. When the deer was killed, everything was used. The toes were ornaments, the antlers were tools, the sinew bound their tools together, such as on this hoe would have been used in the gardens. And this is sinew, and this is a branch from a tree, and this is basalt, such as we quarry right over here in the Trap Rock Quarry. And I used this recently, and I wouldn't want to have to use it very long. Now, in their hunting, the men used bows and arrows. Bows and arrows that you see replicated for the Tunxis history is very, very different than the bows and arrow art of the Plains Indians. Plains Indians were riding horses, and they were shooting buffalo while riding a fast horse. You couldn't possibly have managed a bow of this size. But in our Tunxis people, the idea was for a good distance to get a deer and bring down a piece of game. And the arrows were tipped with flint. Flint had to be traded to the Indians over in New York State because we had no native flint, or very little, in Connecticut. This is bound to the shaft with a sinew made from a squirrel. A squirrel was also a game animal that they used a lot. And the feathers are the turkey feathers that we saw just a minute ago, cut down, and the idea of the feathers is to make the arrow fly smoothly and fast. We have many of the stone artifacts here in the building, and if the man of the family brought home a deer, it was thrown down, and from that point on, it was the woman's job to not only take the hide off it with a scraper or a cutter such as this, but also to cut the meat up. And this is a wonderful stone point. This is a replication. In other words, it's made by Indian methods, but it is not an Indian piece. And again, the sinew and the wooden handle, and she would cut the meat up into manageable chunks with that. Now you come to the point where you have your game, you have your garden product, and you have a hungry family. And now we want to talk a little bit about how they did their cooking. In ancient times, the very earliest cook pots were made of bark. And obviously, if you have a pot made of bark, you can't set that pot in the fire. So how did you cook your food? This is made of birch bark, very flammable. It has pine pitch sealing it, or spruce pitch sealing it, another flammable item. The secret of their cooking was to put in your venison and put in your veggies and some water, and then you heated fist-size rocks in your fireplace, in your fire pit, and you drop them into the food. And the first rocks might start at simmering, the next rocks might start at bubbling, and you would pull out the rocks as they cooled, put in more rocks. Finally, when you had it starting to cook, you would cover this over, leave the hot rocks in there, and to all intents and purposes, you had a crock pot. The next cooking adventure that the ladies had was with soapstone pots. Now, in Bristol, there is a quarry where the Indians quarried soapstone. Soapstone is a very soft material, and they would quarry it with a pick such as this. And I found this pick in the quarry in Bristol when I rediscovered the quarry in 1980. So I have hafted this. That means there's a handle been added to it. It's nothing more than a forked stick. And my substitute sinew. And this is my interpretation of how this would have been hafted because of the shape of the piece. And with this, believe me, you can give a good whack. And this is what they would have quarried the soapstone to make their pots with. Now these pots, there's a beautiful soapstone pot in the Plainville Public Library's collection. We do not have one. But they would have been about like this, and they always had little ears on the side for lifting. These could be put directly into the cook pot, into the cooking fire. So that was a big step forward. But they were heavy, and they were hard to make. And if you lived down in Willimantic, you had to trek all the way to Bristol, spend a couple of days making a pot, and with the last whack of the pick, you might ruin it. And so it was a hard job to get a cooking pot. Then they got into the pottery age, and they started making pottery pots, which was much, much easier. We have a lot of good clay in most places in Connecticut. And again, this is a replication. The reason for the point is because they would dig a hole in the ground, set the pot in about up to here, and then light the fire around it. And the designs changed over the years, but primarily a cooking pot was a cooking pot. But even on such a humble utensil, they always had to have a little pretty decoration. And this is put on with nothing more than a stick. And inside it's all smoothed down with a cobble from the river. And this was gray clay, of course, when they started with it. But when they kilned it or put it in a fire upside down and let it burn and let it harden, it turned this reddish color. And you can see the fire marks on this. The Tunxis had no written language. And this is very unfortunate because there's so much more we would like to know about these wonderful people that had this land before we came. Before white man contact, there was no way for them to record their history or their family stories other than in stories. And generation after generation, they passed their stories down, father to son, sitting around the campfire, probably in the winter in those wigwams. It was rather snug, and they would sit around the fire, and same as children today, Daddy, tell me a story. And the stories would be passed on, and then that little boy would grow up and pass it on. The early accounts that the colonists wrote of the Algonquin-speaking people, and our Tunxis in particular, are not too dependable. The white people, we must realize at that stage of history, were quite biased against the Indians. This is the era when they were referred to as filthy savages and ignorant people. They had no desire to learn the ways of the Indians or even to admire their living with nature. It was two great cultures clashing. So we can't depend on those early written histories for description of the Tunxis people. But we do have the stories that have come back down. We do have some songs that have come back down. But there's so much we don't know about the Tunxis people that we would like to know. The Tunxis children, I think, were very lucky. They had the whole of outdoors to play in. They were truly nature's children. They knew about the wild things. They knew about what was good to eat in the fields and in the woods and in the streams, and they knew what not to eat. They knew the mushrooms and they knew the animals. As they played in this natural playground, they learned the ways of the wild animals so that later they could hunt them and kill them, but they also learned, why does the squirrel build a nest up there? What does he eat? They knew that the muskrats harvested and stored the cattail roots, and in times of starvation, they would raid the muskrat's hiding spot. They knew that the squirrels and the certain of the other animals would store the ground nuts, and they weren't above raiding those little food deposits if they were really starving. They had a great respect for nature, and they treated nature well without destroying and without wasting. The hunting was done, as we've seen, with a bow and arrow, with great respect for other deer. And fishing, of course, in this area was magnificent. There were many signs around Hamlin Pond before the area was developed. Back in the 1970s, I found nice scrapers and nice points there, indicating that at least fishing encampments were there. Whether they were permanent or just seasonal fishing encampments, I don't know, and we will never know. But they fished the rivers with spears. They fished with nets. They fished with lines, with sinkers. Many ways to catch, especially the shad coming up in the springtime, and the salmon. That Farmington River was loaded with salmon. They also fished from their canoes, and they had built beautiful birch bark canoes. There was plenty of things for these people to eat. There was no lack of food in this valley for them. And even now, if we knew which were the good foods and which weren't, you could go out on the mountain, up on Pinnacle Mountain, and probably sustain yourself for a while. But we're afraid to try that because, you see, we're not nature's children. The games that they played were lacrosse, which the Indians invented, but they didn't invent it for a game. They invented it to train the young people for a future life. It was rough and tumble, and it was good training for battle. Snakes was a very popular winter game, and to play snakes you had to take a log and drag it through the snow for a long distance, maybe a mile. Then you would take water and dump it into this trough you had created and let it freeze really hard. Then they had long sticks, nice and smooth, take all the bark off them, and then at one end you would carve the head of a snake. And everybody had their own. Maybe somebody had a little red paint on his, maybe there was a little pattern on somebody else's. And the idea of the game was to start at one end, the uphill end of this trough, and throw your spear down and see how far you could snake it. And sometimes they travel for a mile or more. And that was a game of skill, and it was a game teaching them to throw things straight. Again, preparing them for later life. Bows and arrows, contests with the bows and arrows were very popular, and foot races for long distances over heavy terrain. Again, it was a matter of preparing their bodies for a tough life. They had swimming contests, they had wrestling. Wrestling was very popular. It developed the bodies, it developed the reflexes. And games with polished stones. And we've just found what I believe to be a gaming stone. And this is perfectly, absolutely smooth. And what they did with these is they would make a design on the ground, drawn on the ground, and then these were kind of skittered across to see who could get in a certain square. Nobody knows for sure exactly how the games went, but they loved to gamble, and they loved any kind of a game of chance where they could show their superiority. And we have some other things that I would like to show you in just a second, and we'll be right back. This picture is a drawing of Morris Hart, and Mr. Hart collected Indian artifacts from the Plainville area and around the Plainville area all his life, and he donated to the Historical Society a wonderful collection that is the nucleus of our Native American room. In back of me is one of the framed collections, and there's another showing all different kinds of points, from little bird points on up to spearheads. The larger ones, of course, were not bow and arrow points. Jenny Coles was a wonderful lady who lived out her complete life up on Unionville Avenue in Plainville. Jenny was gentle and quiet and a little lady. She was a librarian in town for years, and I had many pleasant days sitting in Jenny's kitchen with a blue and white teacup in front of me and perhaps eating some of her fresh baked scones as she told me what it was like to live at the turn of the century on a big farm before machines, when everything was oxen and horses and powered by animals, even down to a machine that was run by a horse, by a dog on a treadmill that turned the meat in the front of the fireplace to cook a big roast. Jenny had wonderful memories, and she remembered her grandmother talking about the Native American people of this valley. One of my favorite stories I call Laundry Day, and it concerned Grandmother Tyler being left alone on the farm with the children and a young Indian boy that they employed. Now, this boy lived in one of the Tunxis camps and spent a lot of time on the Tyler Coles farm, and evidently the men were away overnight at least, hunting. And so she was there alone. Well, in the middle of the night, she woke up and heard a noise under her bed. And reaching over and peering under, looking up at her were two dark eyes, and it was the little Indian boy hiding under the bed. Well, immediately, thoughts of murder and mayhem came to her mind, never realizing the little boy was scared to death because the men folks were all gone and he was there with the women and the children. So she leaped out of bed, threw on her clothes, and said, "We're going to do the laundry." And the little boy was quite surprised. But he helped her and went out dutifully to the well and hauled in pail after pail after pail of water, and she scrubbed all night long, scrubbed the laundry to keep the boy busy and occupied. And when the men folk came back with their hunting produce, they found a very clean but a very tired Grandma Tyler. And the other story that I like is from my end of town. I live up on Ledge Road, and the early Hamlin house was way up on the top of East Mountain, up where the reservoir is today, or Crescent Lake as it's known. And up there was a large log cabin where the Hamlin folk lived, and they always left the door to the cabin open and always left food on the table if they were out hunting or trapping or down in the village for something, because that was a common route for the Indian folk passing through, and they took it very kindly if you left them a little snack. Many's the cold morning when the frost and the snow covered the land. The Hamlin folk would wake up and find Indians wrapped in their blankets or in their furs. By that time it was blankets, laying on the floor in the kitchen next to the stove, keeping warm. There never was any problems. The family was never threatened. They had a very friendly relationship with the Tunxis, as did most of the colonists in the valley. But I love these first-person stories that actually come down to us from folks who had the memories. And this is a case of, just as with the Native Americans passing their family stories on generation to generation, Jenny Coles passed that on to me. And while I wasn't privileged to be a member of her family, I'm passing it on to you. When the white people really filled the valley, things became very different for the Indians, and their land started to disappear. Their Native American way of life was changing very fast, very sadly. But a few things did linger, and one of them was the way that they took care of their children. And we think we're so clever today with disposable this and disposable that. Well, this, as everybody knows, is a cattail, grown commonly in our marshes. And in a town such as Plainville, where we have almost 3/4 of our area is wetlands, we have plenty of cattails. And in this bag I have cattail fluff. And this was used to line moccasins, but it also was used to keep the babies clean. And this would be packed around their little bottoms. And when it was soiled, it would simply be disposed of. So the next time you drive by a marsh and you see a cattail, you know that that's a disposable diaper. Also, there were mosses used for this purpose, but I've yet to find a variety of moss that wouldn't be pretty scratchy. They grew gourds and used them for a lot of things, such as scoops and cups. And you can grow these in your garden. And this is a nutcracker. You would put your nuts, put a nut here where I've got corn because I didn't have a nut. And then you would hit it with a hammerstone. And these are simply cobbles out of the river. Very early, of course, before white man contact, they used stone to make their axes with. And this is a wonderful axe head. This would have been hafted onto a wooden handle, and this is what they would have used to gouge out for their canoes and things after the tree was pretty well chewed up with fire. The ways of the Native American people did change quite rapidly, and towards the end, Tunxis started to disappear from this area. Some went to Massachusetts to Stockbridge to live with Tunxis Indians who had moved up there previously. They were also invited to come over to New York State and live with some of their brothers over there. Finally, a lot of them went to Wisconsin and joined the tribe out there, and I believe there are still people out there with Tunxis blood in their veins. Now here, the few people that stayed found their land disappearing. They found especially their hunting grounds disappearing. They had to travel farther and farther into the forest, or even to find the forest, because everything was meadows. The colonists cut down all the trees, of course, to have fields to plant their corn and so forth. And the last Tunxis Indian died in 1820. They didn't leave us a written language, but they left us beautiful melodious words like Pequawba, Quinnipiac, Chippewa, and Connecticut. Our very name of our state is an Indian word. And so there's not a lot left of a beautiful tribe of people that could live with nature, and people who respected nature and didn't waste her wonderful gifts. And these were the Tunxis people, our native Indians. You know, this area must have been an exciting area with the wigwams and the fires smoking the fish and smoking the meat towards winter. This was a very exciting time of year for the Native American people. They had to prepare for a long, cold winter. And one of their major crops, of course, was the corn. They grew what was called the Three Sisters, and it was the corn, the beans, and the squash. They also grew pumpkin. They cultivated some wild plants, such as jack-in-the-pulpit, which was called Indian turnip. And the Indian corn was nothing like the corn that I've just taken out of these husks, which is nice big ears. This was about the size of the Indian corn, and this had been perfected from a wild grass that had been brought up from Mexico by traders, Indian traders. And of course, this is what we ended up with. This is cow corn or field corn. The Indian corn was taken care of by the Indian ladies, called squaws, and this is an authentic reproduction of a hoe made of a piece of basalt, which is what they mine over in the trap rock quarries, and it's on a special kind of a branch that grows straight out from a tree, and this one is put together with rawhide. They also use sinew, and of course it was back-breaking work, unless those ladies were a lot shorter than I am, and this thing probably weighs 7 or 8 pounds. So it was a good day's work, and when you got your harvest in, I guess you really were happy to have it. They also hunted for turkeys and quail, partridge, deer. The white-tailed deer, of course, was a staple of their economy, making their clothes, their food. They used the bones to make tools with. They used the bones to make fish hooks with. And in just a minute, we'll look at some of the things on the river. This is the spot where the little brook brought the water from the Clear Spring out into the Tunxis River or the Farmington River. And this area right in this spot would have been very heavily built up by the Indians. Starting at the bottom of our display, looking at some of the lovely chipped points that they would have used for their bows and arrows. Some are quartz, some are other stones. Working around clockwise are some of the things you might find at the site of an Indian encampment such as this, or an Indian village. One is a piece of bone. They used a lot of bones for tools, and the other is a piece of nut. It seems like nutshells stay a long, long time in these areas. The next item that we see is a sinker, made to hold a net or a line down when they were fishing. And then come freshwater clam fragments of their shells. Freshwater clams were very prevalent back in colonial times. And then a beautiful scraper that would have been used to clean the skins of the deer that were caught in this area. The rivers were full of fish, salmon and trout and shad. Canoes were used for transportation whenever possible, and there were a lot of them in the river. Fishing was by net and spear and line, and we just saw one of the ancient sinkers used to hold down either a net or a line. Deer and turkey were plentiful and were hunted in the forest that covered most of the land. White-tailed deer supplied most of the Tunxis needs, their clothing, their food, their tools. In 1994, as we stand here near the village site, we would have had to walk a long, long way to get to good hunting grounds. This is why the Tunxis Indians left. Civilization was cramping their hunting grounds, farms were cutting down the forest, and the deer and the wild turkeys were almost non-existent. And so they left for Massachusetts and New York and finally for Wisconsin. A few stayed on in Farmington, and the very last Tunxis Indian died in 1820. Wow, what a gorgeous view. We're up in Bristol looking directly to the east. We can see Tomaso's Quarry from here where we're standing. And this is the site of the Woodland Indian Soapstone Quarry, discovered in 1892 by Dr. Frederick Williams. Soapstone goes way back, and they're still trying to test the soapstone particles that are found in the old campsites to give us a definite reading on the age. But let's just say it was a long, long time ago when the native Tunxis people came to this site in Bristol and quarried pots and bowls and platters. They found beautiful quartz here with which to make their points for their arrows. And Dr. Williams said that when he discovered this spot, there were all sorts of bowls here in different stages of manufacturing. The pots that were manufactured here were so prized that they were often mended by boring 2 holes in the soapstone pot and putting some sort of a lacing in there. People didn't want to relinquish them once they had made them. They travel long distances to this quarry. They might come from halfway across the state to use the natural bounty that was exposed here in this ledge. Pots were made in all different sizes. Some were as large as 16 quarts, which is a large vessel, and some were as small as a little cereal bowl. The soapstone formations follow along the Mount Tom range of mountains all the way up into Massachusetts and further into Vermont. The next nearest quarry to us here is in Winstead. The pots were used constantly. Some of them had handles, especially the larger ones had what were called ears that would come out on the sides to facilitate lifting these large loads. And they were used so constantly that some examples that have been found are completely blackened by the fires. I certainly hope that history records this and appreciates us. We have discovered here something quite exciting at this cliff. We found the spot where a little bowl was excavated. And you can see very plainly here where the ear for the bowl was cut out. And then here's the little depression. It was probably a one-eared bowl. And here's the depression. And this stone would have been removed with instruments like this, or a hand pick like this. And you can see that soapstone is very easy to chip away. And the bowl that would have been made here doesn't look like much of a bowl to us, but imagine they could cook in this. And this would have set right in here, but it would have had a little ear on the side of it for turning out the liquid and so forth. And that's what we think. But when you're looking back at something as far back in history as this, it's anybody's guess. The soapstone was quarried with a number of kinds of tools. We had a hafted pick that was used mostly for taking the midlands out after they had worked the spot. This pick, we're not sure whether this was used alone or because it has a flat head, it might have been used with a hammerstone to accent the slap or the break, but it would have been. And you can see you could really make the stone fly. And here's a smaller pick that was probably used for cleaning off the outside of the pot. This is more finely worked. And let's see if we can't break off a piece of soapstone. It's going to be 2092 by the time I get this piece out of here. But you can definitely see that you could fairly easily remove it if you had the muscles to do it. And it probably took them days, if not weeks, to make a large pot. And what they did is they excavated all around the bowl of the pot and left a stem, because often they would have the pot almost completely made and they'd find an imperfection in the vein of soapstone, and they would just leave it here. And that's what Dr. Williams found in 1892, were a lot of imperfect pots. They found scrapers and picks of all kinds, hammerstones. A large number of the tools that were here were made of basalt, and there are veins of basalt running through the soapstone. There are also veins of quartz running through here, and of course the quartz was very desirable for making arrow points. When the first contact with white man occurred, the Indians in this valley had already gone from the soapstone utensils, very laboriously manufactured, sometimes requiring long traveling time and camping on site away from their villages, also very heavy to carry. They had already left that situation and gone on to making pottery out of the native clays. And this is a fragment of a very old pot that was found right in Plainville. Well, I'm still working at it here, and there we are. There's a nice flake of soapstone showing strata of talc and also asbestos. And of course, we know today that asbestos isn't great stuff. I don't know about those people that used it in their cooking pots. But we have a couple of nice pieces, compliments of the nice folks that own the property here. And here on the ledge, overlooking the beautiful valley where the Tunxis people lived, we think very kindly of these people all these years later, all the labor they put into their everyday utensils. People that lived with nature, who did not abuse nature, but certainly must have appreciated all her bounty.